The air was crisp that morning as Grace Walker stepped onto the manicured field of the Westbrook National Canine Showcase. Her boots, worn from years of service and hard soil, contrasted starkly with the polished shoes of breeders and handlers milling about with their pristine purebreds. Beside her, a scarred German shepherd, Shadow, walked in sync, his alert eyes and uneven gait a testament to battles both seen and unseen. Grace's presence stirred whispers. With a faded military jacket and a mutt that bore the marks of old injuries, she looked like a misplaced relic among satin ribbons and diamond collars. No one welcomed her. Some scoffed. Others, like Frank Dalton, the influential breeder with a self-satisfied smirk, didn't bother hiding their contempt. Dalton, known for breeding champions and selling bloodlines for a small fortune, was the king of this world. His dogs, sleek, flawless, emotionless, were molded in his image. Grace's dog, a mystery with a limp. She wasn't here to win approval. She was here for Emma. Back home on the weathered Walker farm, her 12-year-old niece Emma had begged her to enter. "Shadow's not just a dog," she'd said, eyes bright with belief. "He's hope." Grace, who had spent years shutting out hope and reliving combat nightmares, couldn't say no. They trained in secret, beneath rusted windmills and broken fences, using her late father's old obedience gear. Every command echoed memory. Every step with Shadow chipped away at her isolation. The dog, skittish at first, responded not just to instruction, but to her very breath, as if sensing her inner storms. The closer the competition came, the more Grace felt her walls crumble. Shadow wasn't just learning to trust, he was teaching her how. Shadow wasn't like the other dogs. It became obvious early in the training. While he lacked the cosmetic perfection of Dalton's hounds, Shadow possessed something far rarer, an uncanny intuition. Grace would whisper a command, and Shadow would execute it not with robotic obedience, but with purposeful presence. He wasn't performing tricks, he was reading her. One evening, as the sun dipped below the tree line, Emma returned from school to find Grace lying in the dirt beside the barn, trembling. Another PTSD attack, triggered by the sudden backfire of a nearby truck. Shadow stood over her, not barking, not panicking, just watching, grounded and calm. When Emma knelt beside them, the dog gently nudged Grace's hand into his fur. Her fingers curled in response, and her breath began to slow. Afterward, Grace confessed to Emma what she'd known for weeks, but hadn't dared say aloud. "That dog's not just smart. He feels things." It was Dr. Ethan Cole, the local veterinarian, who first planted the seed of a greater mystery. "You know," he said one afternoon while bandaging Shadow's paw, "I've only seen that kind of gaze once before. My dad used to talk about it. Said there was a line of shepherds called Celestials. They weren't bred for looks, they were bred for heart, awareness. He swore one could sense a seizure 10 minutes before it happened, or find a child no one else could." Grace raised an eyebrow. "That's some kind of legend," Ethan smiled. "Maybe, but he knew a man who swore he saw one, Samuel Cole. My father." The idea lingered like smoke. Could Shadow be one of them? The more Grace observed him, the less she doubted. He moved with the dignity of an old soul. He didn't flinch at sudden noises. He assessed. When other dogs barked, Shadow watched. When Emma cried herself to sleep the night her father's memory hit too hard, Shadow crept into bed beside her and stayed until dawn. But legends attract attention. A week before the competition, Grace returned from town to find her training field ransacked. A gate left open, feed bags slashed, Shadow's tracking harness stolen. Dalton. She knew it in her gut. Emma found a muddy boot print near the back fence, one defined for a farmer. Too aggressive for a child. It was a message, stay out. Grace didn't. Instead, she doubled down, replaced the stolen equipment with duct tape and rope, woke up earlier, trained longer. Shadow never faltered. The whispers started to spread. There's a scarred shepherd from the Walker place. Who doesn't miss a mark? Judges took interest. Dalton took notice. And deep in her bones, Grace felt the war wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The National Showcase grounds were a world apart from the dusty fields of Grace's ranch. Gilded banners fluttered from white tents. Pedigreed dogs, perfectly groomed, perfectly postured, stepped in synchronized rhythm beside handlers dressed like royalty. Every detail screamed wealth, precision, status. Grace stood among them in a weathered field jacket and scuffed boots. Shadow at her side, ears alert, for still slightly matted from their final sunrise run. The two looked utterly out of place, like a forgotten photograph in a fashion catalog. Whispers buzzed as they walked the prep lanes. That must be the veteran woman. The one with the mutt. Not even purebred, is he? Frank Dalton's voice sliced through it all like a rusted blade. Didn't realize they let war relics and junkyard dogs compete now. Or is this some kind of charity act? Grace met his sneer with silence. She had nothing to prove to him, only to Shadow, and to herself. But Shadow didn't ignore him. The shepherd's steady gaze followed Dalton's movements with unflinching focus. Like a soldier remembering the face of an enemy. Grace noticed, and tucked the reaction away. They had work to do. The obstacle round came first. Dalton's dogs soared and weaved with mechanical precision. The crowd clapped politely, admiring but unmoved. Then it was Grace's turn. She gave no grand gestures, no shouted commands. Just a nod. Shadow took off like wind on the plains, scaling ramps, pausing precisely at markers, zigzagging through the weave poles with grace that contradicted his scars. But it wasn't speed or flair that drew the crowd silent. It was trust. Shadow never once looked confused. He moved not because he was told, but because he understood. Like he and Grace were speaking in a language no one else could hear. At the final hurdle, he paused mid-run, then looked back. Grace, frozen at the start line, had hesitated. A tremor had struck her hand. PTSD again, brief but brutal. And still, Shadow waited. Not for a command, but for her breath to return. It did. She whispered, "Go." He leapt cleanly. The arena erupted, but Grace couldn't hear it. She was on her knees, pressing her palm into the dirt to steady herself, Shadow already at her side. Nudging her arm, eyes asking, "Are you all right?" And everyone saw, even the judges, especially Judge Douglas Harper, a stoic man known for his obsession with precision. But that day, his usually unreadable expression cracked. That, he muttered, just barely loud enough for the other panelists, was partnership, not performance. Later, as they exited the ring, Dalton appeared again, his face tight, but his smile slick. "Nice trick," he said. "Too bad that dog isn't yours." Grace's brow furrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" He slipped a photo from his coat. A young German shepherd, strikingly similar to Shadow, posed beside a handler. The background, Dalton's breeding facility. This one went missing 6 years ago. Name was Celestia. Could be her son. Could be stolen. Guess we'll find out. He walked away before she could respond. But in that instant, Grace understood. This wasn't just rivalry. This was personal. Dalton didn't just want to win. He wanted to erase the one thing he couldn't manufacture, true bond. And if Shadow was Celestia's blood, then Dalton had a much darker secret to protect. The sky over the fairgrounds had darkened by late afternoon, the warm hues of sunset casting long shadows behind the exhibition tents. But for Grace Walker, the true storm had just begun to gather. She sat quietly in her trailer, fingers trembling slightly as she stared at the faded photo Frank Dalton had shoved into her hands. The dog in the image, Celestia, shared Shadow's deep amber eyes, that distinctive notch on the left ear, and even a faint splash of darker fur near the tail. It was no coincidence. It was blood. But what mattered more than blood was what Dalton intended to do with it. Dr. Ethan Cole arrived just past dusk, carrying an old box filled with brittle folders and yellowing documents. "My dad kept meticulous records on the Celestial Shepherd line," he said softly. Even after the program ended, he suspected the best dogs hadn't vanished, just been taken. Bred in secret. He believed Dalton was involved, but there was never proof. Grace opened the files. Handwritten notes from Sam Cole himself. Breeding charts. DNA markers. Photos of dogs with the same quiet fire behind their eyes that Shadow carried. The similarities were undeniable. "But why now?" she asked. Ethan shook his head. "Publicity. Power. He's gotten cocky. If Dalton can claim Shadow as proof he controls the last of the celestial bloodline, he becomes untouchable in the breeding world." Grace's voice dropped to a whisper. unless we get to the truth first. The next morning, under the guise of routine checkups, Ethan collected a DNA sample from Shadow. The results wouldn't come quickly, days, maybe weeks, but Grace no longer had time to wait. The final event was hours away, a freestyle demonstration meant to showcase handler-dog synergy, instinct, and emotion. It was Shadow's moment, and possibly their last chance. Backstage, Grace strapped on her father's old leather training pouch. Its brass buckle was scratched and dulled, but somehow still solid. "One more, Dad," she murmured, like a prayer. "For everything you taught me." As the lights dimmed, the announcer's voice boomed across the arena. "And now our final competitor, Grace Walker and Shadow." They stepped into the ring together. The music was soft, piano drifting like memories on the wind. Their performance wasn't choreographed to impress. It was a story of pain and healing, of trust built in silence and scars shared beneath starlit skies. Shadow circled her gently, brushing her hand with his muzzle. She fell to one knee, and he leaned into her chest. Eyes closed, the moment mimicking her panic attack from the trial run. Only this time, she rose, and he rose with her. They moved not like performer and pet, but like two halves of the same wound, learning to breathe again. By the time they finished, the arena was hushed in reverent stillness. Then a single clap, then more, until thunderous applause rolled like distant artillery. But it didn't last. Frank Dalton strode onto the stage uninvited, flanked by a handler and a large black shepherd. "I demand the immediate disqualification of that animal," he snarled. "That dog is stolen property and belongs to me." Gasps echoed through the stands. Judge Doug Harper stepped forward, calm but unyielding. "Mr. Dalton, unless you have legal documentation of ownership, I have DNA results of Celestia." Dalton interrupted, waving papers. "That dog is her son, and she was mine." From the side of the ring, Ethan entered quietly. "Actually," he said, holding up his own sealed envelope, "we believe Celestia was never yours at all, and this test might prove who really stole her and where the rest of her litter went." Frank's smugness wavered. Grace stepped beside Ethan, shoulders squared. "You've built an empire on blood you don't own. You used their legacy to make yourself a god and hurt anyone who stood in your way. Not anymore." Security approached. Frank tried to argue, but the murmuring crowd had turned. So had several of the handlers, whispering to each other, some even walking away. Later that night, while the legal team filed motions and the DNA tests were secured under supervision, Grace and Shadow sat by the arena's outer fence. The ribbon they'd won wasn't first place, but that didn't matter. Emma came running with tear-streaked cheeks and threw herself into Grace's arms. "You were amazing," she whispered. "Both of you." Grace looked down at Shadow, who rested his head gently in her lap. "No, sweetheart. He was the miracle. I was just lucky enough to walk beside him." Within the week, as the news exploded and Dalton's reputation unraveled under scrutiny, Grace reopened her family's land, this time as a healing center called Walker & Cole. Dogs and people broken by life came through her gates and left with hope. And Shadow? He was always there, watching, guarding, teaching others how to trust again. Grace had thought her war ended years ago, but this was the one that set her free. Months passed, and the countryside surrounding Grace Walker's farm began to bloom again, not just with wildflowers, but with something far rarer, peace. The gates of Walker & Cole, once rusted and forgotten, now opened each day to veterans, trauma survivors, troubled teens, and rescue dogs with nowhere else to go. They came one by one, bearing wounds the world could not see. And they left, slower, stronger, seen. At the center of it all was Grace. She no longer avoided mirrors. Her hands, once shaky with memory, were now steady with purpose. The shadows of war still stirred beneath her ribs some nights, but when they did, Shadow was there. His steady breath at her side was enough to remind her that survival was not shame. It was a song, and they were still learning the words. Emma grew, too, from a quiet girl who once watched Grace with wide, worried eyes to a confident young trainer who ran obedience classes beside the woman. She now called her hero. And then there was Dr. Ethan Cole. He never pushed, never hurried, just kept showing up, with old stories, vet supplies, and sometimes hot cocoa on long winter days. One afternoon, after a training session that ended in laughter and mud, Grace found herself smiling so wide it startled her. She caught Ethan watching her. Neither of them looked away. The DNA results, when they arrived, were both shocking and strangely expected. Shadow was indeed the last living heir of Celestia, a bloodline engineered for brilliance, empathy, and near-mystical sensitivity. But he was more than genetics. He was proof that the best traits in a creature could rise not from control, but from love. Frank Dalton's empire collapsed in silence. Lawsuits, investigations, and public condemnation swept through his name like a fire through dry grass. But Grace, she never spoke of him again. Instead, she kept building. By spring, Walker and Cole had expanded. A second barn, a modest therapy center, and a small team of veterans turned dog handlers. People came from faraway cities just to see the woman who beat back her demons by walking beside one. Grace sometimes stood beneath the willow tree her father planted, watching Emma and the other kids run through the fields. Shadow, older now but still sharp, often lounged in the shade, his gaze calm and endless. She would close her eyes then and remember the battlefield, the farm, the show ring, the moment she almost gave up, and the moment she chose not to. Because healing isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the soft weight of a scarred paw on your lap. Sometimes it's a quiet dog standing beside a broken soldier, reminding her that she's not broken, just unfinished, and that every soul, no matter how scarred, deserves a second chance at home. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us tell more stories of healing, hope, and the incredible bond between people and their dogs.